Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are opening up an incredibly fascinating set of source material. We're looking at excerpts from the book Faith and Freedom, The Founders' Secular Republic. And, when you look back at American history...
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into that game of historical telephone.
Exactly. We pass down these stories until we end up with these, just fuzzy, monolithic images of the past. Like, if you think about the Founding Fathers, what usually comes to mind for you?
Oh, usually it's a unified group of guys in powdered wigs standing shoulder to shoulder.
Right. All praying together in perfect harmony before they, sign a piece of parchment. But when you actually read the historical records, like the letters, the private journals detailed in these sources, that image just shatters completely.
It really does. The reality revealed in these documents is just far less unified and honestly far more interesting.
Definitely.
They were a deeply diverse group with wildly conflicting personal beliefs, arguing constantly about how to build a nation. And our mission today isn't to take a political stance or tell you what to believe.
Right. No taking sides here.
Exactly. We're just here to impartially examine exactly what the historical sources reveal about the founders' actual intentions regarding religion and how those specific intentions continue to fuel the headlines you see today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we're going to understand the government the founders built, we first have to understand who they were personally. And when you look at this group, they're anything but a unified religious front.
Not at all.
To put it bluntly, if you place them all in a room today and ask them to agree on theology, they wouldn't even make it past breakfast. You'd have a fist fight before the coffee was poured.
I always think a dinner party between Samuel Adams and Thomas Paine would be an absolute nightmare for the host.
Oh, total disaster.
Right, because the sources lay out a very wide spectrum of belief. On one end, you have your devoted Orthodox Christians.
Like John Jay.
Right, John Jay. The first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who actually eventually became the president of the American Bible Society. Yeah. And Patrick Henry actively distributed religious pamphlets. Then you have Samuel Adams, who was a steadfast traditional Calvinist.
And Calvinism, just as a quick refresher, that's the belief in predestination, right? Like, God has already decided who is saved and who isn't.
Exactly. And it required strict adherence to traditional doctrine and, rigid moral codes. So to that group, Orthodox Christian theology was an undeniable reality governing everyday life.
But then you slide down the spectrum and run into the deists, and this is where the monolithic image really breaks apart for me. You've got Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, completely different worldview.
Right. They respected Jesus as a brilliant moral teacher, but they explicitly did not view him as divine. Like, right. Franklin loved debating religious topics, actively challenging the dogma of his day, and Jefferson...
Oh, the Bible story.
Yes. This detail always blows my mind. Jefferson actually took a razor blade to the Bible. He sat in his study and literally cut out the supernatural elements. Like, he sliced out the miracles, the resurrection, the walking on water, and just pasted the remaining scraps into a new book to leave behind only the moral teachings.
The visual of a founding father physically mutilating a Bible with a razor blade is just striking.
It's wild.
But it perfectly illustrates the deist mindset, you know? God is a clockmaker who built the universe, wound it up, and then just stepped back, leaving human reason to figure out the rest. And then, sitting right between those Orthodox Christians and the deist clockmakers, you have what historians call the Theistic Rationalists.
Okay.
John Adams is the prime example here. He firmly believed in an active, rational creator who governed the universe, but he flat-out rejected core Orthodox Church teachings.
Like what?
Well, he didn't believe in the Trinity, for one.
Wait, really? The core Christian doctrine that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are one?
Exactly. He rejected that. And he rejected the concept of original sin, too. The idea that humans are born inherently flawed.
Which was a massive deal at the time. I mean, denying the Trinity was a radical, almost scandalous stance.
Very much so.
Yet, despite his personal unorthodoxy, he saw religion as absolutely vital for maintaining social order. He thought people needed the threat of divine judgment to behave properly.
Exactly. And then rounding out the group, you have the pragmatists.
Yeah.
George Washington would dutifully attend church services, but he deliberately avoided taking communion. He'd actually step out before the sacrament was offered.
Interesting.
And Thomas Paine, in his massively influential pamphlet Common Sense, invoked what he called a democratic God. Paine wasn't pushing a specific theology. His views just resonated with people, even if they didn't fully convert to his radical deism. They were truly all over the map.
What strikes me is the sheer political terror this diversity must have caused them. I mean, they had to form a united front against the most powerful empire on earth, but they couldn't even agree on whether Jesus was God or just a good philosopher.
Right.
They were staring down the barrel of a civil war if they couldn't find some neutral ground.
What's fascinating here is how that exact crisis forced their hand in official diplomatic actions. Look at the 1797 Treaty of Tripoli.
Okay.
It was negotiated during Washington's administration and signed by John Adams to secure peace with North African states. And because they couldn't establish a unified theology at home, they had to be aggressively clear abroad.
Right.
The treaty explicitly stated that the government of the United States, quote, is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion.
Wow. Just flat out said it.
Yes, that wasn't a controversial statement meant to spark debate. It was a simple, factual clarification to a foreign power that they were dealing with a secular state, not a Christian crusade.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate on that one, though. The sources note that John Adams signed that completely secular treaty, but earlier the text explicitly states that John Adams wrote the Massachusetts state constitution to require public office holders to be practicing Christians.
Yep, you did.
So how does that not completely contradict the idea of a secular founding? If he's legally demanding Christian office holders in his home state, portraying him as a champion of a secular republic feels, I don't know, a bit disingenuous.
That's a great point, and that tension highlights a crucial distinction in early American governance. We really have to separate the state-level politics of the era from the overarching federal framework.
Okay, how so?
Under the Articles of Confederation, and even early on under the Constitution, states had immense leeway to establish their own religious requirements.
Oh, got it.
Massachusetts, heavily influenced by its Puritan roots and Adams' own belief in social order, leaned hard into religious requirements. But the federal government was a completely different beast.
Right.
The founders realized that imposing Massachusetts' strict religious rules on a federal level would instantly alienate the Anglicans in Virginia, or the Quakers in Pennsylvania. The federal system had to transcend local religious majorities, or the nation would just fracture immediately.
It's like they were building a shared operating system for the whole country.
That's a good way to put it.
If they hard-coded one specific religious framework into the national OS, say, Calvinism, it would constantly crash when trying to run on Pennsylvania's Quaker hardware or Virginia's Anglican hardware.
Right, exactly.
So finding themselves completely unable to use religion as the source code for the new nation, they had to invent a completely new programming language for the government.
And they found that language in the Enlightenment. This was an intellectual movement sweeping through Europe that prioritized reason, scientific inquiry, and human liberty over ecclesiastical dogma.
So they were looking at philosophers like John Locke.
Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau. These thinkers argued that human beings have inherent natural rights, that reason should dictate human affairs, and they held a profound skepticism of centralized absolute authority.
Whether that authority was a king or a pope.
Exactly.
And you can see that Enlightenment blueprint woven right into the founding documents. I mean, the Declaration of Independence doesn't cite biblical chapters or verses. It uses these sweeping generic terms.
Right. Laws of nature.
Exactly. Laws of nature, nature's God, and people being endowed by their creator. That language is a masterclass in compromise. It's deliberately open to interpretation.
It really is.
It works flawlessly for Samuel Adams' strict Calvinist God, but it works equally well for Thomas Jefferson's detached, deistic clockmaker.
And when you move from the Declaration, which is essentially a philosophical manifesto of rebellion, to the Constitution, which is the actual legal rule book, the shift becomes absolute.
Yeah, that's a big jump.
The Constitution entirely lacks references to Jesus, the Bible, or divine providence. It is a profoundly secular document.
Which is pretty shocking.
Right. The only mentions of religion are actually negative. They are restrictions specifically limiting religion's role in government, like the Article 6 clause banning any religious test for public office.
It feels like completely leaving God out of the ultimate legal rule book of the land was a massive political risk in the 1780s. I mean, they must have had a terrifying reason to omit it so thoroughly. They had just fought a war over taxes and representation, but they were acting like a state-sponsored religion was the ultimate existential threat.
Because they were terrified of repeating European bloodshed. To build a republic based on equality, they had to fundamentally reject the divine rights authoritarianism of the European monarchies they had just fled.
Right.
For centuries, a king's authority was tied directly to divine mandate, and the church acted as an arm of the state. If you dissented against the church's theology, you were literally committing treason against the king.
So disagreeing with the priests meant you were an enemy of the state.
Exactly. The founders looked at centuries of religious wars in Europe. Catholics killing Protestants, Protestants killing Catholics, all using state power to enforce their dogma, and concluded that intertwining religious authority with civil power inevitably leads to tyranny and blood.
But, writing generic philosophical documents in Philadelphia is one thing. Actually enforcing that separation in everyday governance is another. How do you convince a deeply religious populace to keep their faith out of their local laws?
Well, this triggered intense legislative battles to build what Thomas Jefferson later called the Wall of Separation.
Right, the famous...
We coined that phrase in an 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists, reassuring a religious minority that the federal legislature would make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But the architectural groundwork for that wall was actually laid years earlier in Virginia.
Primarily by James Madison and Jefferson.
Yes.
The sources detail Madison's 1785 memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, which is just a pivotal moment. Virginia was debating a law proposed by Patrick Henry that would have used tax money to support teachers of the Christian religion.
Because Henry thought public morality was decaying, and the state needed to fund churches to fix it.
Right. And Madison fought this tooth and nail. He warned everyone about the absolute danger of letting the government dictate which religion gets public funding.
Madison recognized the slippery slope. If we connect this to the bigger picture, keeping government out of religion wasn't just to protect the state from theocratic rule. It was equally about protecting the sanctity of religion itself from the corrupting influence of politics.
Protect the church from the state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Madison argued that when you attach state power and lucrative tax dollars to a church, you inevitably corrupt that church. You attract opportunists seeking political power rather than spiritual truth.
Think about this for a second. Imagine opening your mail today and finding a tax bill from your local government, specifically funding a church across town, a church you don't even attend, preaching a theology you fundamentally disagree with. You'd be outraged.
Oh, absolutely.
That visceral anger is exactly what Madison was tapping into. He argued that forcing a citizen to financially support a religion they didn't believe in was tyrannical. And that fight culminated in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was drafted by Jefferson.
And that explicitly stated that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship or ministry whatsoever.
Which is huge.
It was. That Virginia statute severed the financial and legal ties between the state and the church. It served as the direct precursor to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which became their grand compromise.
Right.
The First Amendment ensures the government cannot sponsor or establish a religion. That's the Establishment Clause. But it also guarantees the government won't hinder your right to practice your faith, which is the Free Exercise Clause. It created a framework of strict neutrality, allowing a pluralistic society to flourish organically.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We've just spent all this time detailing their meticulous, desperate efforts to build a secular framework, to erect this wall of separation, and to keep dogma out of the Constitution to avoid European-style bloodshed.
Yeah.
Yet, if you look at early American history, it is absolutely saturated with references to God, providence, and religion from these exact same men. It's in their speeches, their proclamations, their essays. How do we reconcile the secular laws they wrote with the highly religious language they constantly used?
The contradiction is glaring, I'll admit.
Yeah.
But it resolves when you understand that the founders were supreme pragmatists.
Okay.
They were attempting a radical political experiment in a predominantly Christian society. And they understood human nature. They knew that a purely philosophical argument about John Locke's natural rights wasn't going to motivate a freezing farmer in Pennsylvania to pick up a musket.
Right, they needed something more powerful.
Exactly. Invoking divine authority and divine providence added immense emotional and moral weight to their cause.
You see this dynamic perfectly in George Washington's 1796 farewell address. He cautions the country against the impostures of pretended patriotism, but then he explicitly calls religion and morality indispensable supports for political prosperity.
Yes.
And John Adams, in a 1798 address to the military, flat out stated that the Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people and was totally inadequate for the government of any other.
Consider Thomas Paine again.
Yeah.
He was a deist who despised organized religion. Yet, in common sense, the viral sensation that convinced the American masses to actually support independence he heavily relied on biblical references.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he used the language of the Old Testament to frame the rejection of the king, not just as a good political idea, but as a righteous, holy rebellion against an idolatrous monarch. He wasn't pushing a religious agenda, he was using the cultural vernacular of his audience to move them to action.
So they deliberately kept religion out of the government machinery, out of the tax codes and the Constitution, but they constantly used its emotive power in public discourse to motivate the populace.
Precisely. Religious rhetoric was a highly effective political tool. It helped frame the American cause in terms the average colonist understood, and it elevated their political ambitions into a moral crusade.
Right.
It allowed them to rally disparate, squabbling colonies into a cohesive force. They respected the profound power of faith to inspire civic morality, but they drew a hard line at letting that faith dictate public policy or compel public funding.
Okay, I have to push back on their foresight here. They thought they could use the fiery, world-altering language of religion to win a war, and then just neatly put it back in the box when it was time to write secular laws. Weren't they being incredibly naive about how future generations would interpret all that rhetoric?
Naive might be an understatement.
Right. Leaving behind a massive trail of, quotes, praising God while simultaneously writing a secular legal code seems like a recipe for total confusion down the line.
The confusion was inevitable, and you've identified the exact root of our modern conflict. The founders established a very delicate, nuanced balance between public rhetoric and secular law. But in modern political warfare, nuance is always the first casualty.
Sadly, yes.
That precise blend of secular legal framework and religious public rhetoric has fueled intense, polarizing battles today. It's actually giving rise to the modern Christian nationalism debate.
And looking at the sources, we see this playing out right now in our courts and legislatures. And just as a reminder to you listening, our role here is to impartially report on what the sources say about these modern movements, not to endorse a side.
Exactly.
On one hand, you have the modern Christian nationalism movement, activists and prominent politicians. The sources point specifically to figures like House Speaker Mike Johnson claim that America was fundamentally founded as a Christian nation.
And to support this, they point directly to that trail of rhetoric we just mentioned.
Right. They highlight John Jay's religious writings, or pull from those early religion-heavy state constitutions like John Adams's in Massachusetts. But at the same time, they largely de-emphasize the strict secular nature of the federal Constitution.
The historical analysis in the sources outlines that this movement seeks to wrap American civic identity tightly around Christian beliefs, often advocating for policies that reflect evangelical Protestant values.
Okay.
Critics of this movement, however, point out that it fundamentally ignores the founders' explicit, hard-fought intent to avoid enshrining a single faith. They argue that by pushing for a Christianized government, it risks signaling that non-Christian faiths or secular ideologies are somehow inherently un-American.
But the sources also highlight fierce pushback against the idea of strict secularism. Critics of strict separation, including Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, argue that Jefferson's metaphorical wall has been weaponized far beyond its original intent.
Yeah, that's a major point of contention.
They argue it has transformed from a protection against state-sponsored religion into a barrier actively suppressing religious expression in public life, bordering on what they call religious hostility. They feel that aggressive secular policies unfairly marginalize people of faith from the public square.
This raises an important question about how we manage that precarious balance today, and we are seeing the pendulum swing in recent Supreme Court decisions.
Like which ones?
Well, the court has recently ruled to allow taxpayer dollars to flow to religious schools in certain contexts where they were previously excluded. And they have upheld religious expressions by public employees, such as a high school football coach praying on the 50-yard line.
Right, the praying coach case.
The consensus from the historical source material is that the founders intended a government that is strictly neutral to religion, neither sponsoring it nor showing hostility toward it.
A neutral playing field.
Exactly. They envisioned a marketplace of ideas where multiple faiths, or no faith at all, could compete and coexist without ever capturing the coercive power of the state.
It really feels like the modern debate is like trying to bake a cake by reading only half a recipe book. If you only read George Washington's farewell address and John Adams's quotes demanding a religious people, you bake a theocracy.
Right.
But if you only read the Treaty of Tripoli and the secular clauses of the Constitution, You bake a dish that completely ignores the deep moral and religious convictions that actually motivated the people to build the nation in the first place.
You really do need the whole picture.
You have to look at the whole cookbook. You have to see that they wanted personal, fiery faith and cold, public reason to exist simultaneously without destroying each other.
The danger occurs when modern rhetoric attempts to merge the two. When government policies align too closely with any one specific religion, it risks the exact entanglement, the exact corruption of both the church and the state that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson dedicated their political lives to avoiding. The true genius of their system wasn't forcing citizens to choose between faith and reason. It was designing a constitutional framework flexible enough to respect deeply held individual beliefs without allowing any single belief system to commandeer public policy.
So, what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive right now? We live in an era of intense information overload. History is constantly being flattened, weaponized, and politicized into 10-second sound bites on your feed.
It really is.
But having this nuanced understanding of the founders equips you to see past all that noise. They weren't monolithic deities carved out of marble praying in unison.
No, they were pragmatic, diverse, fiercely opinionated thinkers who argued constantly.
Right, but they ultimately figured out a way to balance their own deep personal piety with the absolute existential necessity of secular governance to keep the country from tearing itself apart.
And that leads me to a final thought I'd like to leave you to mull over. As the sources demonstrate, the founders were absolute masters at using the widely understood language of their day, which happened to be religion, to rally a deeply divided public around a radical new secular framework. They used that shared cultural vocabulary to build a nation out of nothing.
Right.
If those same incredibly pragmatic founders were transported to our time, trying to unite us today in a society featuring thousands of different faiths, secular philosophies, and fractured cultural backgrounds, what shared language or moral rhetoric could they possibly use to rally us together without leaving anyone out?
That is a phenomenal question to ponder because the game of historical telephone hasn't stopped. It's just happening on social media now instead of on parchment. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into faith and freedom. Keep questioning source material in your own life. Keep looking past the powdered wigs, and we'll catch you next time.